this video I will present to you RC sliders. RC sliders are EDAP controllers of symbols on the stage. There are all kinds of sliders and each of them has quite a few options, but one defining characteristic of sliders is that they allow you to transform objects around their individual transformation point. That means they're not treated as a group, rather each one is transformed around its own individual transformation point. And as you can see here, each of these flowers rotates around its own transformation point. There are lots of other kinds of transformations which we can achieve with sliders, but this is one of the most interesting, unique and distinct. In the context of character animation, sliders can also be extremely useful, and their uses range from a rotate slider like this one to a scale slider like this one, where we can scale the pupils individually, to a first frame slider which allows us to pick a different set of eyebrows or eyelids, just scrubbing through the contents of the eyelids symbol, to a first frame slider like this one for the mouth. But first frame sliders are more than that. They are dual function like most sliders actually are, and they allow us to swap symbols. In this case we can swap between a frontal mouth and three-quarter mouths, which have been designed to work with views past a certain point like this. So we have matching mouths here and we can swap between these. I'm just holding down Alt to swap. Another kind of sliders is a visibility switch, which is a modified slider. Now this is a first frame slider which allows us to turn the character, actually going through the content of the symbol and snapping at the end of operation, but then look at the limbs when we keep going in this direction like this. With the visibility switch we can switch the perceived layer order of the elements. So these arms and legs appear to be on top of the torso, and when he turns the other way, this set of arms and legs appear to be on top of the torso. What we're doing is basically switching on and off the visibility of some duplicates. I will have to go through this as well. I hope that the demo so far has been interesting enough to keep you hooked for the boring part, because there's a lot of stuff to talk about. Now, before I go on, there is a page dedicated to sliders on our website, and you have to look into it and read all the details, because there's so much. I will most certainly miss one thing or another. Now let's dig into the less exciting but very necessary and much longer part of this video: how to create and use RC sliders. As with all EDAP objects, there is a command in the commands menu: create and manage RC sliders, with two shortcuts, F6 and Shift plus F6. And there is a button in the EDAP commands panel, but the most accessible and easiest way would be the button in Smart Magnetry Helpers panel. Now, in Animate there is only one broad category of sliders, while in Flash there are two. I will go to Flash in a second, but before that, let me select all of these objects on the stage. These are all graphic symbols, each one on its own layer, and press the button. We are presented with a dialog which allows us to choose the type of slider. We'll start with the rotate slider. We can choose color, we can choose its size. Let's go for normal, whether it will be horizontal or vertical, and whether it will be multifunctional, or we will limit the functionality to primary or secondary action only. Here is a table with all this information, which we'll look into in a moment. Let me just press create, and an EDAP object will be added to the stage. I can move it with the default selection tool and put it where I like. A layer was created in the timeline called RC sliders. This type of slider, we call it attached slider, has two buttons on the side of the rail, and this is the slider's handle. We operate the slider by dragging the handle with Kinematics. I'll just create a keyframe here and drag. What you see is that the squares rotate each around its own transformation point. The further I go from the center, the faster the transformation. This is the primary action of the slider. This little button here will pop a dialog. I'll select one of these objects and pop the dialog. The dialog allows us to add or remove elements to the sliders group. So if I go remove, now one of the elements has been removed. It is not a part of the sliders group anymore. It also pops slider settings. We'll look into those a little later. The other button creates keyframes for the sliders group. So if I go here where we're not at a keyframe and press this button, you'll see that keyframes were added to all elements except for the one that is not part of the sliders group. Now let me add this one to the group again. Now it will rotate with the rest, and look into the transformation points. If we move these away from the center, you will notice that rotation will happen around the transformation points. There you go. So even the indicators show that transformation happens around these transformation points. I'll get rid of this keyframe and go back to the normal view. Now let's look into Flash. The difference here is that in Flash we can create a slider without a selection. Just like this, I will again create a rotate slider. There it is. And what you will notice is that this rotate slider has a circular handle. This kind of slider allows us to use elements that are on the same layer. They don't have to be, but they can be on the same layer. And we can modify them. It works with the current selection. So nothing's attached to it. If there's no selection, nothing will happen. But we can select just any elements, just like this and like this. So some elements selected, and rotate these, and then choose another bunch and rotate these. So this is what makes this type of unattached slider quite handy. Unfortunately, it's not available in Animate. In Flash, we have both. Let's go back to Animate and look at the table. So if we look at the rotate slider, the no modifier option is rotate. We already saw that. But if we drag with Alt down, we will see that the slider takes the flipped state into account. To do this, we need to have a flipped object. Let me flip this one horizontally like this. And now, if I rotate without the modifier, they all do the clockwise and counterclockwise. But if I hold down Alt and rotate, you'll see that the flipped one will rotate in the opposite direction. So this is what taking flipped state into account means. Now let me add another slider before going into more information. Let's just select these, or let us select only these, and add a move horizontally slider. Now, move horizontally, create, and put it just just here. Now let's look at the table. So no modifier action will move horizontally, while Alt down will take flipped into account. So let's see what happens. This is just moving the objects left and right, while if we hold down Alt, one of the objects will move in the opposite direction because it has been flipped. If I flip one of the others, that probably will happen to it as well. So we get this result. And this affects the alternative action of the slider as well. Let's look at the last column here. Shift down will make them rotate as a group. So I'll hold down Shift and rotate. That's what you get. They rotate as a group, and the center of rotation is the center point of the bounding box of the group. If I hold down Alt and Shift, the flipped ones will rotate in the opposite direction, but again, the center will be the center of this bounding box. This is what you'll get with Shift and a Move transformer. Shift and Alt, a completely different type of action. Now, let me introduce T-points. Get rid of this key to align the objects again, and add a T-point to one of the objects. Let's just add it here. I'll put it just at the tip and go out. So this one has a T-point, but in the layer stack order it's not the topmost. So the actual rotation will happen from the topmost instances T-point. So if we rotate as a group, this is what it says. If there is a T-point present, we'll use the T-point for the Shift action, but that's where it happens with this center. If we would like to use any of the others, say for example this one, we need to drag it to make it the topmost layer, and now this T-point will be taken into account. So this is how a T-point works. The T-point for the group. So in this group of objects, this one is the topmost. So for this kind of shift action, this T-point is taken into account. If I grab this one and put it on top, that's the one that will be taken into account. Okay, let's look into primary and secondary actions and the options to limit them. So if we go into slider settings, this slider has been set as multifunctional, but we can set it as secondary only, which means that we don't need to hold down Alt, and the action will always take into account the flip state. So now if I rotate without holding down Alt, the flipped ones will rotate in the opposite direction. This is exactly what I did with the bunny ears. This is set to secondary only, so the ears always rotate in opposite directions. We can also, from the settings, make the shift mandatory, and then the objects will always behave as a group. So now it's secondary only with the T-point as the center of rotation. We can hide and show the slider layer by pressing F6. We can name the sliders by going inside and using the text tool to type anything onto the Your Stuff layer. We can, if we like, tint the sliders to give them unique colors, to group them or associate them visually with certain objects. If we are inside a flipped container, similar to transformers, we can use this button to straighten controllers, so this will make the rotate text readable again. If we go out and flip the container again to restore readability, press the straight controllers again. Now F6 will also restore the default size of the slider, so if we're in a zoomed container and these are too large, hiding them and showing them will re-show them at their default pixel dimensions. So if we go back to 100% and hide and show, they will again appear at their default pixel dimensions. Finally, let's create a first frame slider and end this video here because it's already too long. Let us choose a first frame slider. Let us this time make it small and vertical and primary only, which means that it will do just to change first frame and go create. Now, this is our first frame slider here. If we grab the Kinematics tool and drag, you will see this graphic symbol has a counter inside, so we're setting the first frame for these. If we go to any of these frames and click on the Create Keyframes button, only the elements in the sliders group will get keyframes, and again we can set the frames for these elements in the group. So this is how the groups are very different for all of these. This is this sliders group, so creating keyframes will create keyframes for that group. This is this sliders group, so we can create keyframes for this group here. And the rotate slider contains all of the elements. With shift down, if there were labels inside, we would only see the frames with labels. Let's do this just as a test. Add a few labels here, just an A label, and multiply it a few times, 4 of these. And now grab the Kinematics, hold down shift. So we're jumping onto the frames with labels. The click only response will make this slider non-draggable, so we won't be able to drag, and we will only be able to progress one frame at a time. This is specific for the first frame slider only. Snap at the end of operation, we already saw that in this demo here, which will mean that when we end a transformation like this, the elements will snap into position, like what happened to these arms. If we switch it off, they will remain where they are. The visibility switch, this will be my last demo for this very long video. Later I might make some more videos dedicated to specific sliders, but I will end it with a visibility switch. Here is my setup. This arm appears behind the head. To start, I will duplicate the hand and the arm using the element welder's duplicate feature, which will create 2 hard-welded duplicates. I will grab these 2 hard-welded duplicates and put them on top of the head, which will result in the arm appearing over the head now. Alright, for these 2 selected, we'll now create the visibility switch. It does not have any settings, I'll only change its color to bright green. Here it is. Let's move it away, hide the controllers and click the switch. What happened was that these elements that are on top of the head were swapped with an invisible proxy object, which makes it appear as if the arm goes in front or behind the head. It's as simple as that, but it is very effective. So it allows us to do this kind of switching, which I did demonstrate to you here with this switch, which is also set to offset the limbs. Clicking on that, the correct appearance of the limbs is restored. So we're switching them on and off in an offset phase. Alright, I'll end this video here because it's already way too long and I have provided an overwhelming amount of information. I hope though that it will be useful and you will be able to start using the extremely powerful and flexible RC sliders in your rigs and various projects. Thank you for watching.